It is always a pleasure when Frank Foti gives us some time. I, some of the best moments of my NAB experiences have been in his booth talking to him. And some of the other great moments have been when he has come around to talk with us. And so I'm really pleased. And I know everybody here is anxious to hear, Frank, what you think about the state of audio processing, what you guys are doing, and what's ahead.
Well, first of all, Barry, it's always a pleasure to um, sorry guys, it's like you get in a meeting and then all of a sudden the phone and the text start, they go into interrupt mode. Sorry, my apologies. But it's always a pleasure to be a guest with your group, and I always welcome the time when we're able to just, connect and catch up at trade shows and things of that nature. Given that, in our little world here, we always have stuff going on. Um, what the main efforts that have been coming out of, our activities has been focusing on being able to get our products, processing related and others, into the cloud. And we've successfully done that. Last year, we introduced a product known as Forza, which was predominantly set up for streaming. And now this year, we introduced the FM version of that, which has gotten off to a great start. Just so that everybody knows, our, let's say, our dancing with the stars, if you will, into the software or the cloud domain was not necessarily just taking the products that we had in the rack and porting that code over. In some cases, we've taken pieces and parts from Omnia 11 and a few others, and use that as the building blocks or the framework for what we've done. But I will say that the team, and I'm proud of the team that we have, because when Cutting Edge, which led into becoming Omnia, started, it pretty much was me doing everything with respect to algorithms and processing and the products in general. Now it's become a real team. Many of you probably are aware that for a lot of time, Cornelius Gould has been very involved with us. And while Corny has been doing a lot of work on his own and along with our friends over at Angry Audio, he and I still put our heads together from time to time to commiserate on things having to do with processing, and who knows what may or may not end up in a final product. That being said, I also want to give a shout out to another one of our developers, a young man by the name of Rob Dye. And Rob, along with Jim Kuzman and feedback from Paul Kriegler and my Italian brother from another mother, Max Pandini, they put their heads together and they came up with a lot of the basis of what is in the Forza products. And to Rob's credit, Rob, who's basically been in the background working directly with myself and Corny in getting our designs into the final form factor that would be code-based if it was DSP or embedded. Rob, whose background is audio and acoustics, came forward with some ideas for AGC and dynamic limiting that we incorporated into the Forza product. And one of the things that's really cool about that is that there's let's say, an operational framework to the algorithms, where the algorithms are able to have an understanding of the dynamics coming in, and as such are able to make adaptations so that the signal can minimize itself with respect to what I call processing annoyances. I'll define that in a bit because there's a topic I want to address in a little bit here. But the goal that we've always had is, how do we generate a competitive signal for broadcasting or webcasting, yet minimize what sounds like annoyances to the ear. And that could be anything from harmonic distortion, intermod distortion, pumping, things that just, don't add up well, if you're understanding what I'm talking about. And Rob has accomplished that with some of the algorithm work that he put into Forza, and along with most of my work, believe it or not, has continued to be in the back end, the final limiting section. And to that effect, matter of fact, our people are nipping at my heels because I guess the call for papers for NAB is coming up, and I'm debating whether or not to put an abstract together. But I spent some time working on something that I've always had a combination of interest in and felt as a need. And this is in the area of what we'll commonly know as intermodulation distortion. One of the things that we deal with in signal processing, especially now that we're in the numeric world digitally, is, the ear can be affected by one of three types of distortion. The worst, one of the worst of which is aliasing distortion. And that falls into algorithmic development, that if you try to have a sampling rate that's too low, or you're generating harmonics that are beyond the Nyquist frequency, they're going to come folding back into the audio as aliasing products. And that's a form of distortion that you definitely don't want to have. And it's as nasty as harmonic distortion, which is, just clipping the daylights out of something to the point of where the audio sounds broken, if you will. The last piece, and it's more of a subjective quotient, if you will, is what we refer to as intermod distortion. And intermod distortion can show up in a couple of ways in signal processing. Probably the easiest description I can give you guys is, think back of taking, let's say, some of the older analog products, and this is not a knock on analog or really any processor, where you could get access to the attack and release times. If you start running stuff really fast and drive the audio, let's say 10 dB or more, you'll have a control signal develop that is going to be operating almost at the speed of the audio. And what that means is that the control signal is going to intermodulate the audio signal. So while that's happening, you're going to say, well, what does that mean? What do I hear? That's the aspect where how many times have you listened to audio where it just sounds really smashed or dense or packed up, where transients are like totally sucked out? That's intermod distortion. Now, in a dynamic section like a compressor or a limiter, and if you have access to the attack and release times, predominantly release, you slow it all down, smooths it out, and you go, that's great. The challenge becomes is in the back end, the final limiter. There too you can end up with intermod distortion. The most common one is our low frequencies, where the wavelength is so long that during that wavelength period, while it's into the clipper, guess what? It's taking the rest of the spectrum into the clipper with it as well. So in effect, what you have is an intermodulation happening within the clipper, and that's where you'll end up hearing the mids and presents and highs start to get that smeary, smashed sounding, and sometimes a bit of a tearing sound. Well, I'm giving all this description because I spent a fair amount of time this summer working on ways to minimize or eliminate that. And in doing so, what the end result is audio that retains the competitive edge that you're looking for. And group, I'm not going to sit here and talk about loudness, because that's a whole other debate. That's a whole other topic. But I also know that, people on the radio that, I can't tell you how many times people say, Frank, that sounds really good. I need it to be another dB louder, or what have you. And I'm not trying to go there, but knowing that, the marketplace, they want a competitive sound. There are ways to minimize or suppress the intermod distortion that can happen in final limiters and in the dynamic sections. So from my world, that's predominantly where a lot of my effort has been spent, and it'll hopefully see the light of day within the next year or so, as Santa's little elves are busy at work here, here at Omnia and within the Telos Alliance.
May I
So
ask a question?
oh, yes, please. I was going to say, I'll stop there, and if people have questions or there's directions you guys want me to take the discussion, I'm happy to go there.
Oh, great, great. The question I want to ask right now, you're talking about the work that you've done, and you talk about loudness. If you would, just for a few minutes, the difference between 125 and 99 and 115 and 94, let's say, or pick any pair of numbers you like. How big a difference is that really going to be on the air and through the modern radios?
Or you're talking about modulation levels.
Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, think about it. As I look at the mod monitor here in my office, if somebody's sitting at 120, 125% modulation, and another guy's sitting at 100% modulation, that's almost a 2 dB difference. Now, that said, as I'm speaking to you unprocessed, if I was to shift my voice by 2 dB, you're not going to hear much in level. But what's going into that transmitter is pretty compressed. I mean, even if it's heavily processed or not. So you shift something by 2 dB, you can hear the difference. And one of the things that, when I say we, excuse me, one of the things that we, and by we I mean myself, Leif, have done, was we came up with this method of embedding the pilot, which allows the audio legally to be always at 100% modulation included with the pilot. That's 1 full dB. That's why we have this thing called 1 louder, because it's 1 dB louder than conventional processed audio, where the audio is at 90% and the pilot takes up the other 10%. So to answer your question, Barry, if somebody's at 125 and somebody's at, say, 95, there's probably about a 2.5 dB difference in loudness there, and that's perceptible.
But if you're at 125 and 120, or on FM you're at 110 and 105,
That's about this.
The listener's not going to know the difference.
No, but the story that I've shared in the past, and I'll share it again. When back in '83, when I was working at Z100 with Scott Shannon.
I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about that. A little bit of history, but forgive me. Give me a moment here, because it's very appropriate that today our program is being sponsored by Broadcast Depot, and son of a gun, their special right now is the Omnia processors. And I think that's about as convenient as you can get.
I would say so.
And so I just want to take a moment. Mary is with us, of course, but you're here, and we have all these things, the Omnia 9, which you mentioned, Leif, the Omnia Volt, which I don't know if that's the one that we want to talk about with Corny, but I really got my mind into this 11 and the fact that the screen is so large and your diagnostics are so much more available and here we go back to maintaining and looking at your transfer and seeing what's going on. And I'd like to get to that, but let's go back to the little history here. You got started, and audio has been your passion for a long time.
Oh yeah, I recently gave a talk at my high school. This year has been the 50th. Is the 50th year of my graduating class, and I gave my senior project in physics was bringing my audio amplifier in that I built, which was a Heathkit AR-1500, which I still have and still works. Yes, I've recapped it numerous times, and I went through the whole explanation as to how it worked. And I will say that audio has always been something that has mattered to me. Back in the day, in fact, the fellow was one of my better friends in high school. We used to sit in class and debate the specifications between a Shure V15 phonograph cartridge up against an Ortofon or something like that, and elliptical and conical styluses and things of that nature. So yes, audio has always been very important to me, and I really started to lock into it and focus in on it when I went to work at WHK and WMMS in Cleveland in 1978. And that's where I, met up with the gentleman who became my mentor in this industry, and it was also a great set of ears. And Barry, I know you did a lot of work with him, Jim Somich, who has passed on. And it was Jim who sat me down one day, and Jim crafted a nickname that has stuck with me to this day. He took my last name, which is Foti, and he stretched it out and to the point of being Foti. And he'd say, Foti, you're going to learn how to listen to the radio like you never listened to it ever before in your life. And boy, was he right. And so, historically, Jim and I learned a lot. But the over-the-air sound of both WMMS on FM and WHK on AM meant the world to us. I mean, we put our hearts and souls into it, and I've just carried that forward. I took this interest in this black magic called audio processing, and back in my younger years, I would I would take the manuals home of anything I could find and study them and read them and figure out and have an understanding as to why circuits were done a certain way, and insofar as being able to create dynamic compressors and limiters, and then starting to really want to understand how the final limiter, the whole, not only just the clipping, but to be able to manage distortion created by clipping. So yeah, it's Barry, the best thing I can say is it's in my blood as much as steam oil, coal, and soot and cinders are in my blood.
Well, I like that. I like that a lot. And I remember when you I didn't know you in Cleveland. I got to know Jim, and what a great guy. And his articles and I've got them posted on the BDR.
Oh, yeah.
About audio processing. When you look into what he's talking about, a lot of it makes sense. And as I remember, as you sequenced into New York and started really to get into the first really production processors that you made, I found that they were really loud. I think you and Ron Jones were sort of almost in a foot race for that recognition, but you were clean, and this was something that Mike DeRoe and Bob Orban, they were more interested in fidelity. They were not interested. Yes, they had to put some loudness in because otherwise nobody would buy their boxes. But you were the one that really got to where a station could sparkle off the dial.
Well, Barry, thank you for saying that. And I learned a lot in New York. Obviously, I still call it the Super Bowl of markets here in the United States. And I'll never forget, before we had Z100 on the air, I was sitting in a hotel. We were all staying at the time, it was known as the Meadowlands Hilton. And the nice thing about being in the Meadowlands in Jersey was there's virtually no multipath out there because it's all flat. And I remember sitting in the hotel room, and I had headphones and a table radio, and I'm scanning the dial. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I feel like my ears are being fused together. And while a lot of the guys that worked in many of those stations have since become friends of mine and customers, we'll leave some call letters nameless, but you'll be able to figure out whom. I remember thinking, we've got to come up with a way to compete with these guys, yet we need to stand out on the dial. And the short story is that earlier that summer or that year, I'd been at NAB and I saw the Texar, what were the Texar audio prisms, and had talked to, Glenn Clark. And I thought, and at the same time, because I was living in San Francisco and was good friends with Jesse Maxench from Orban, and I knew Bob. And I know that Bob was working on what became the XT2 chassis. They had it on K101 in San Francisco. And when we put Z100 on the air, all we had was, you guys might laugh at this, all we had was a barefoot 8100 because the station had been prior WVNJ. So we added a composite clipper, made it a little louder, but it did not have that, top 40 sound. And I remember Scott was, it was driving him crazy. And so I called out to California and asked if, I said, look, I'm at this brand new radio station in New York City. We need to do something, and wondering if you guys have another prototype of this multi-band chassis, which was a modified 9100 to get the 6 bands. And Jesse said, Frank, Bob would like to help you, but he doesn't like to let prototypes outside of an area where he can't hear them. So I figured, okay, that's done. So I reached out at the time to Allied Broadcast to see if I could get a pair of these prisms to try. And true story, group, I made the call about 3:00 in the afternoon. About 10 minutes later, I get a phone call from Glenn Clark himself. He said, he goes, I understand you want to try a pair of these. I said, yep. He said, is this New York City? I said, yep. He said, well, he goes, I'm holding a ticket on Allegheny Airlines in about an hour and a half. If you could pick me up at the Newark airport, we'll have them on the air tonight. And I went over to Newark, picked up Glenn. He had them stuffed in a suitcase, and we put them on the air that night. And the next morning, I remember Scott Shannon saying to me, Franco, because Scott has his own nickname for me, which was Franco. He said, Franco, whatever you're doing, Z100 sounds loud and proud. And that's what began it. We had a set of prisms, the 8100, a composite clipper, and I had an EXR exciter, which was, an offshoot of the Aphex oral exciter to give it some sparkle. And then we had that for a number of years, Barry. And then as everyone else kind of figured out what we were doing, I then started to realize I got to start hot rodding stuff. And that's when I got into doing stuff on my own. And, that's when at this point, if the group has interest in the story, Glenn at the time had a prototype of what became the replacement Card 5 for the Optimon. And we did the testing on Z100, and it sounded great. And Glenn called up one day and said, look, I need you to FedEx that thing back because we need to test it up against the first run of the cards, and we'll get you a card, as soon as we get these done. I figured, okay. Well, in the meantime, Emmis launched Hot 103.5, which had a Greg box on the air. And boy, that changed everything. And my backup at that time was we had an Aphex Dominator in the rack. And I started saying to myself, every time I lean on the Dominator, it gets too busy. It goes back to that definition of intermod that I gave earlier. So that's when I started, hot rodding stuff on my own. I didn't even have a schematic. I just one night sat there with, took the unit off the air and had the backup processing on during the overnights and started poking around the oscilloscope to determine where the attack and release resistors were and how the thresholding all worked. And one thing led to another, and I started modifying stuff and put that on the air. And that's how the product that later became known as the Vigilante was born. It was born at Z100.
That's fascinating. I think in that time period, a lot of engineers were experimenting. I know that we had moved from the sped up Automax Volumax, the Max brothers, into the early Optimods and the Texars and of course things like that. But as you said, as these things started to settle in, the stations all started to sound very similar, and you needed a way to stand out on the dial.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And actually, an interesting tidbit to this story. And any of you guys out there who know Greg Oganowski, please feel free to ask him about this because there's an interesting. This all happened before I came up with the modified Dominator. Steve Church, another tremendous individual who's, up in broadcast heaven. Steve was working at the same company I was, which was Mallrite Communications. And Steve, and who's a, old friend with Greg, they go back to their radio days in Detroit. Steve had called up and he said, "Hey, I got this box from Greg. I have it on WMMS. Why don't you come to Cleveland? I want you to hear it." So I did, and it was a modified Greg AM, the 2350, and it had been modified to use cards 8 and 9 from the Optimod, and it sounded amazing. Well, Steve, talking to Greg, we had initially created what was going to be a nice little deal where we were going to have Greg build us a bunch of those boxes as an exclusive for Mallrite. We're going to put them on all the Mallrite stations. So Greg is building these, and Mallrite, in their infinite wisdom, which probably parallels that of the current ownership of the Cleveland Browns, if you guys get my sarcasm there, Mallrite management came and said that they were cutting budgets and that they were cutting the funds for us to have those boxes. Well, Steve had to deliver this bad news to Greg, who's now on the hook for these things personally. And it was at that time that Emmis had purchased 105.9 in Los Angeles, which had been owned by Doubleday, as well as 103.5 in New York, which had been owned by Doubleday. And one of these boxes was on Los Angeles. Well, when they went in there, they're like, "Wow, this thing sounds amazing." And Greg said, "If you want, I'll make you a deal." And that's how all those boxes ended up at Emmis. They ended up there because it came out of an idea that Steve Church and I had, and we were going to do with Greg for Mallrite. And Mallrite, and their, excuse my language, and their infinite stupidity, ticked off Greg, and those boxes ended up competing with us. And that's what drove me to build what became the Vigilante.
It's interesting. You can't ever count on some of these people that have control to really think things through beyond the bottom line.
Well, and you know what, Barry, I remember when it happened because, even though Greg has had a long career with Orban and they're a competitor, Greg and I have always been friends, like good friends. I mean, when we see each other, we go out, we'll go get some iced tea or, catch up. Matter of fact, one year a box showed up here in Cleveland and had a whole bunch of little HO trains that came from Greg's parents' home because he wasn't going to use them anymore. And I remember at the time feeling bad because, something that was out of my control and Steve's control was going to, do something that wasn't the best for someone that we knew. And the fact that it came back around to bite Mallrite in the where, although I was able to fend it off on my own, I remember thinking, man, that's just not a way to do business. So,
no. To give Greg his due, he's always been cutting edge. I mean,
without question. And it was Greg. Greg. I've teased him about this. I remember hearing there was low end on Hot 103.5 like I'd never heard before.
Yep.
Oh, like I'd never heard before. And the song that they were playing was Higher Love by Stevie Winwood. And if any of you guys, matter of fact, it's sitting right here because I use it to this day to test algorithms. And about 30 seconds into the song, the drums hit and then the bass hits. And I heard bass come over the radio like thinking, oh my God. And I remember talking to Greg about it, and Greg he said, Frank, he goes, I'll tell you what that is. He goes, it's a shelving equalizer, and it's a shelving equalizer that not only does it boost the lows, but it naturally carves out a little bit of a notch around 150 hertz. And I remember thinking, man, Greg, you don't want to be telling me that, because, guess what I went and did? I went and, got out my, how many of you guys have on your shelf the Op Amp cookbook, and schemed together some EQ circuits of my own, and, and then that ended up into the processing system as well. So, but yes, when it came to, or I shouldn't say when it comes to stuff of that nature, filter design, timing, and processing, I will, I'll be the first to say Greg's right up there. I mean, if there needs to be a Mount Rushmore of guys with, an audio processing, Greg Ogonowski needs to be on it.
At some
The
point,
best processor I ever heard was a Greg Labs. That was my competition in Dallas, where Greg lived at the time. And I would look at that station on the mod monitor, and the meter went from 85 to 100 and never got out of that range. But when you listen to it, it was as open as it could be.
Yep. And a lot of that comes down to what I was talking about before. If you're able to design algorithms where you're able to manage intermod and get everything just right, you'll get that. That's why, I know there's the whole thing about, over compression, hyper compression and the loudness wars, this, that, or the other thing. And I get it, but I also know that there are ways to deliver competitive sound that can sound good. I mean, we've been doing it for many years. Now, again, I want to say, I'm not saying that to promote that style of processing. I'm saying that the capabilities are out there. But yes, Greg's always been, top notch.
I think, what was it, Ron Jones that put an 11 on his knob at one point, turn it up to 11 sort of thing, because that's what some people would do. And yeah, I mean, I've seen stations where they'll run through a decent audio processor, and they'll chase it with one of yours as an example. And all too often, you talk about getting a very pressed sound on the air. That's what can happen very easily if people don't pay attention to what they're doing.
Barry, you're right. And the thing I want to share with everybody is that if I dial it back 40 years, I'm at Z100, and we were competing obviously with WPLJ. Electrically, WPLJ was probably electrically louder than Z100, but to the ear, Z100 was louder. Why? Because when you crank something up to be super dense, the ear will get desensitized. Whereas if you have some dynamics in there, the ear doesn't become as desensitized. And here's the analogy, and you can do this the next time you go in the bathroom. Turn the hot water key on and let the water get really, really hot. Then take your finger, and if you stick your finger under the hot water and keep it there for the first few seconds, it's going to be hot. But then as the nerves desensitize, it's not hot anymore. Well, now, if you do that, take another finger and then pulse it against the hot water. Every time you hit the hot water, it's going to seem hot. It's the same thing with the ear. And that's what we did with Z100. And the thing I'll share with you, so that I don't want everyone to think that, well, the Z100 processing was only Frank. Scott obviously wanted the thing to burn a hole on the dial. And he never would, to his credit, he would never come in and go, Franco, it's not loud enough. What Scott did, because he would say that he knew that his hearing had probably shifted, he used to have his DJ buddies and DJ program directors who used to come in and do guest shots on the weekend on the radio station. And I can honestly tell you that every one of them would usually go out to dinner with Scott and his wife and say, man, Scott, processing on this radio station is killer. And then Monday, Scott would come in and say, Franco, station sounds amazing. You know, Mark Driscoll was here on over the weekend. He thinks it's the greatest. And, you know, I mean, you name it, back in the 80s, you know, all the big name CHRPDs that Scott was friends with at one time or another did some, you know, unknown DJ fill-in slot on the radio station, and they all would, you know, unbeknownst to me, you know, basically, you know, go to Scott and say, Frank, you know, station sounds amazing. And it was because we tried to have that dynamic punch that printed well on the air. And it goes back to, Barry, what you were saying about being able to have a level of quality, yet the competitive level at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. About the same time you're talking about, I think it's when Potomac Instruments came out with that meter that could register dynamic range.
Yeah, the Quantoro. Yep.
One of the New York stations, probably PLJ, was somewhere under 0.5 dB dynamic range. And
I mean, you know, they had it cranked up. They had it cranked up pretty good, and you know, and that was the direction that the program director Larry Berger wanted. And you know, we you know, I was at the time I was married, and my wife, she hated being in the car with me, because not 20 seconds would go by that I wasn't going back and forth between 100.3 and 95.5. It's almost like I needed to know that every moment of modulation, we were beating the pants off them. I mean, that's just how it was.
Now, over the years, the succeeding generations of the Optimod and the Omnia made major changes. And I think, and check me if I'm wrong, that between you and Corny and Leif, especially when that Omnia 9 came along, which was what a commercial version of what Leif had demonstrated in Amsterdam. Wow. You got into that clipping cancellation and other things that were not just delay lines, but actively correcting the audio.
Well, yes. And you know, one of the things that we've done a lot of work in, like I said, is in the back end. And being able to identify what signals can cause trouble and either suppress them or minimize them, as well as now intermod, is where the magic is. And you know, one of the things that we're able to do, you know, by doing everything numerically in the digital domain is, you know, the things I'm about to share with all of you, we're only pipe dreams. You know, I mean, you know, now we're able to take a look at the signal in the frequency domain. And within the frequency domain, there's a whole host of things that you can accomplish that are literally impossible to do in the analog domain. I mean, when you say the frequency domain, what do you mean? Well, you know, when you have an audio signal, we can look at it in the time domain, which is like sine waves, or in the frequency domain, where we've actually broken things out into bins of frequencies. You know, the common function that does this is called an FFT, fast Fourier transform. And once you have it in the frequency domain, the rules change. Now, that said, you know, you might think, oh, well, okay, are we going to get a free lunch? Well, I wish I could say yes, but, you know, everything has an Achilles heel, okay? And the FFTs have their own, let's say, quotient of sound, if you will. You know, the most common would be, you know, FFTs are what are used in doing the frequency parsing for codecs. And as you get down at lower bit rates, you start to hear all the coding anomalies. Yeah, some of it's due to the low bit rate, but some of it's due to, stressing the functionality of how an FFT works. But for what we're dealing with here, yes, there's a lot of things we're able to use an FFT for with respect to minimizing or suppressing harmonic distortion, intermod distortion, and things of that nature. So yes, if I may say so modestly, we're kind of proud of being able to accomplish those for signal processing.
Well, that's a good key to cue my next thought, which is talk to us a little bit about the front panel of your latest version, because there's so much that you can see, not just a little tiny display that shows you a couple of bands, but you really can do diagnostic here that you couldn't do before.
Well, Barry, one of the things we've tried to do is to put things together in a manner of speaking of where it would be having a user interface that would kind of sort of replicate the days of when we had boxes in a rack, back in the analog days. That coupled with being able to utilize software to show what the composite spectrum looks like, to show what the left-right audio spectrum looks like, to have the ability to have an oscilloscope, where you can actually look at the waveform, be if it's left, right, I'm speaking for FM now, or the composite signal. These tools are pretty common today in software. And so, no reason why not to provide them, especially given that there's probably a lot of broadcasters where, the days of every radio station being able to have, their own in-house set of test equipment, signal generator, oscilloscope, it was rare that a lot of stations had spectrum analyzers. If we're able to, provide those as tools or part of a toolbox, why not? I think it only, becomes like a value add, if you will.
Absolutely. And if you can, just as an example, see the leases you without having to drag out all the test gear, you can solve problems almost before they occur.
Right.
There was a discussion that I saw the other day about a station where a particular announcer had complained that she couldn't hear herself at all. And they finally went in and checked, and sure enough, in her headphones, she couldn't hear. And they found out that in the sleeve, there had been a shorting of two wires. And in fact, what she was listening to was the L and the R in series, and they would cancel.
Yep.
So if you have an Elysian pattern, you'll find it right away. But
Yep.
if you have to go hunt and peck, well, there's another story. Frank, let me ask you then, and I'd love to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think that at some point you could send us Rob to demonstrate some of the things that you can see and do with the product?
Barry, I would say yes. Rob, Rob's a bit more of a quiet guy as compared to me, but I'd be all for having some of our guys, be able to talk with the marketplace, and where your group get to know more of our people, because while I love doing this stuff and I'm still driven by it, last night I was up putzing around with something at like 11 o'clock at night. I have a way to do development work at home as well as at the office. This is something that will at some point be a baton that I start handing off to others and allow them to carry the legacy forward. And in fairness, they have good ideas and fresh ideas. I've never approached this whereas it can only be my way. There's certain things that we'll do, and I'll say, okay, guys, technically I know what you're trying to do, but realistically you really need to do it this way, or give thought to it. But seeing ideas come forward from more of our team has been wonderful, and I've always encouraged it. I'm glad to see it, and the thing that's exciting about it is that for the marketplace, it's an insurance policy. Insofar as what's part of Omnia processing is going to go forward. Whereas, if you look at some of the other organizations, you got to wonder, some of the, as much as I'm still a kid because I still play with trains, the clock on the wall says that, you're 68 years old and why you can still do it. And I'm glad that I can do it, having younger people with just as much or more passion and ability and drive is I think crucial to the industry and to our organization.
Absolutely. And that was the theme that we were talking about in April at NAB.
Yeah, and Barry, I apologize. This summer I got pulled into too many different directions where I wasn't able to, pull something like that together for today. But if, we can have a rain check, be happy to come back. I'll bring some of the gang and basically introduce them to you guys, and then sit back and you guys can spend some time with more of our team.
That would be great. Absolutely great. And we'll arrange for that.
Great.
Does anybody else have a question for Frank? We're coming up on.
And actually, guys, I screwed up because I thought our thing started earlier, and I've got a 3:00 that I've got to get to. So I don't have to jump off right now, but if there's questions, I have a few minutes that I can take them.
Okay. Any questions? Quick. What would you like to know from Frank Foti?
How big is the string layout?
Well, okay, that's a multi-part answer because in HO scale in my basement, I'm lucky to have a large basement. It's about 20 feet wide by 22 feet in depth. There's no scenery yet. It's the framework's all there. So there's that. In the 8th scale world, I'm a member of I'm a member of a club called the Lakeshore Live Steamers, where we have about 10 acres of land in a county park where, the main line is about a 10-minute ride. And then good friends of mine have a 90-acre blueberry farm in Geneva, Ohio. And the main line there, while it's growing, is about a 30-minute ride. And I think, as a matter of fact, if there's a time that we could do this live, I would say we go out to Geneva, because there we have a wonderful foyer of steam engines. There's a couple of nickel plate Berkshire engines. We have a Union Pacific Challenger, New York Central Hudson, all coal fired. And I'm sure if we do that, we'll have them all out there, and we'll burn coal, and some of you guys will even, if you want, we'll teach you how, and you can pull the throttle a little bit.
We have a lot of folks that are interested in trains. Gordon Carter, whom I'm sure you know,
yeah.
Rich Wood, and people like that. They often put trains up behind them. Brian Urban down there in Texas.
Back in 2018, because so many people would ask me about the steam engine, which is my Boston and Maine Pacific, known as Eastwind. I brought Eastwind and some of the cars out to Vegas, and there's a little 8th scale railroad down near Hoover Dam. And we spent a Sunday afternoon with about 250 customers. And I ran Eastwind for customers. And Joe Cipriani, the voice of ESPN, was behind me. And that was weird. It's like you hear this mega voice. And my good friend, record producer Gary Katz of Steely Dan fame, was out there. And, they all went back to their hotels with some soot and cinders all over them. We could do that.
I remember when you did that, and I really regret that I missed it. I was not able to get there, but
Barry, I assure you, one day we'll make the live steam thing happen, and I think it would be fun, even if it's for your group.
Great.
I think it would be a lot of fun.
This may be a last question if somebody else wants to ask a question, but I'll ask this. How did you find Leif?
Leif was when we acquired Linear Acoustic back in 2008. Leif was working with Tim Carroll, and they had been part of something called Octave, and prior to that, Leif had worked at Orban, and Leif went to work at Orban. He came over from Sweden, thinking he was gonna, like work with Bob, and I guess they had him doing like, rudimentary user interface stuff, but Leif's passion is processing. So
Oh man.
he left and he went and did Octave, and then some people there kind of let's say mistreated him, if you will, and he and Tim then went and created linear acoustic. So the basis of all the linear acoustic processing was done by Leif, and then he wanted to do something in FM, and at this time we were all working together. I said, Leif, we have the wherewithal, and that's how the Omnia 9 was born.
Oh, really, really great. I was just stunned when I saw it the first time. That was really something.
Smart guy.
Well, everybody, any last words before we let Frank jump off here? Well, Frank.
I hate to do this with 1 minute left, but we had a presentation from the Super Hi-Fi people a few weeks ago, and you talked about porting your processing to the cloud. Is that where the future is? And as a manufacturer, how do you sell and organize your product to whatever the future of the radio industry is, if it's going to originate out of the cloud and we're no longer buying boxes with very nice interfaces on them, and you're essentially becoming a software company?
Well, Ed, that's a great question, and the way I'll answer it, because my people fought me on this. They wanted everything to go in the cloud, and I told them, I said, you can't put everything in the cloud, because I know there are people out there that they still want a piece of hardware. Granted, the hardware is running software, right? But their comfort is a piece of hardware. So at least we will, meaning our company, we will support the hardware side of life, yet, because while the cloud, everyone that's moving, I should say everyone, as the people in the world are migrating towards the cloud, it's still on the front end of the bell curve. If we basically blew off all hardware stuff, I mean, it would, we would feel the effect for a while. So this is going to be, I told our people, it's a gray line we got to walk for a while. And how long that's going to be, I don't know. But I'll tell you this, future Omnia releases, there will be hardware and there will be software. And it'll be that way for a while.
Frank, I can't thank you enough for your time and enjoyable discussion. And yeah,
thank you to you and your entire group for the opportunity to spend time with you guys.
Between Zoom and YouTube, we seem to have something on the order of 55 folks here, maybe closer to 60, which is great. And I keep seeing good comments in the comment box. And you tell me what works for you in terms of timing, and let's get your guys and you back here when we can.
Barry, we'll make that happen. And group, I'd love to stay longer, but I'm already seeing messages coming through bugging me for the next thing. So I wish you all the best.
Thanks again, Frank.
You're welcome.
Be well.